Instead, our celebration to our great ideas with petal shower. Celebration is going on. Okay. Thank you so much, sir. I would request you to have your speaking seats. Jai Bhim. Jai Jyoti. Like conducted by Satya Shatak Maitri Sangha, today's event will be also get inaugurated with the oath of preamble of Indian Constitution, which inculcates the noble principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity taught by Lord Buddha. For that, I would like to request Mrs. Nehal, please come up here to read the preamble of Indian Constitution, and we people are going to follow her. For that, I request to all of you, please stand up for the oath.
Thank you, sir. We, the people of India, into a sovereign, socialist, democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. Do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this constitution. Thank you. I am very thankful to Satyashatak Maitri Sangha and all my friends for giving me such a great opportunity to read the preamble of the Constitution.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mrs. Snail, for such a beautiful preamble reading. With this, I would like to say that the program has been inaugurated. Now we are moving further. The next part of this event, that is nothing but we are going to felicitate the honorable dignitaries present on the dais. For that, I request Mr. Siddharth to felicitate Professor Akashi with flowers and a book of biography of छत्रपति शाहू महाराज। Thank you so much, sir. Now, I request Mr. Siddhodhan to felicitate respected Mr. Siddharth, sir. Thank you, sir. After this, I will call Miss Priyanka to felicitate Mr. Sachin, sir. Thank you. Now let's have a brief introduction about the Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. For that, I would like to call Mr. Sachin. Please come and give us brief introduction about Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. Mr. Sachin, sir.
Let me open my pages here. I won't take much of your time because already the program is delayed. However, I would like to thank all of you for being present at this book inauguration program. And I would also like to thank Dr. Akash Singh Rathod for coming such a long way from America and being here and adorning this platform. It's my duty as a convener of the Satyashodak Maitri Sangh to give a brief introduction of SMS. We call it as SMS, short form. And since this program is organized by Satyashodak Maitri Sangha, it is the organization's duty to give all those assembled here a brief introduction of our organization. First of all, I would like to inform why our organization is named as Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. Mahatma Jyotirao started a movement for the liberation of the Shudras and Ati Shudras. We call them the Bahujan Samaj today. Satyashodak was the name of the Samaj or society which he formed, and by calling themselves Satyashodak or truth seekers, they intended to liberate the Bahujan Samaj from age-old slavery. It can also be said that all those leaders who struggled to free the Bahujan Samaj from their slavery and who fought to establish liberty, fraternity, equality, and justice were essentially truth seekers or Satyashodaks. Therefore, as our organization pledges to walk in the footsteps of our great liberators, it is but appropriate that we named our organization as Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. The middle word Maitri has been chosen to inculcate friendship in a divided society and united. Maitri has many layered meanings: benevolence, kindness, friendliness, amity, goodwill, active love for others. Without a feeling of Maitri or compassion towards living beings, it is not possible to work for the upliftment of any society. The last word in our organization's name is Sangh. Since the work of emancipation of society is an arduous task and is not the work of a single individual, it is obvious that people willing to work for this common cause are a Sangh. Sangh consciousness is a feeling of togetherness and strength. We believe that the problems of society can be solved through collective resolve and collective action. It is not the work of any single individual to establish fruitful and important values in human society. Without organizational strength, no individual can accomplish anything important for the society. This is the reason that Sangh is more important than any individual, and therefore it is the name of our organization. It's obligatory that an organization working for the upliftment of society should have a constitution, and the members of the organization adhere to the constitution principles. If not, the organization pushes forward like a ship without a compass and without a clear-cut objective. In India, where so many organizations are person-centered and the prevalent culture, Satyashodak Maitri Sangh functions in a different way. With honest intent and right path, the Sangh is inspired to work in the society in a constitutional and democratic way. Sangh members stand on equal footing, have equal value irrespective of what task they do, what work they do. The constitution of Satyashodak Maitri Sangha is a guiding light with written objectives. And since every action of the Sangha is thoroughly discussed before implementation, we hope to falls the rise and fall that we see in other organizations. To establish liberty, equality, fraternity and justice in society is the fundamental guiding objective of the Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. Not only do we believe in the slogan, educate, agitate, organize, but we strive to implement it through appropriate programs. We believe that continuous awakening can be brought about by the spread of literature of our great leaders, by creating new literature, and also by a boost and platform to intellectuals like Dr. Rathod who contribute to such kind of literature. Keeping in mind the objectives of the Sangh, we awaken the masses on relevant social, political, economic issues. Satyashodak Maitri Sangh does not participate directly in politics, does not fight elections, does not have a political party, and does not work for any political party. But it does aim to make the people politically wise by organizing programs on relevant political issues. Also, our organization is not a platform to spread any particular religion. Recently, the organization launched Shahu Ambedkar Maitri Abhiyan campaign. The campaign is a good example of how Satyashodak Maitri Sangh works in the society. Through the campaign, we intend to highlight the common agenda of both the great leaders. By conducting such programs, the organization tries to build unity and fraternity among different communities. Since ideology is the only cementing medium, the Sangh through Shahu Ambedkar Maitri Abhiyan tries to highlight the common ideology and the common agenda of Rajashri Shahu and Dr. Ambedkar. Recently, eminent people like Dr. Hari Narke, Dr. Ratan Lal from Delhi University, Dr. Shriman Kokate is a historian, and many others, it is impossible to name all here, have delivered their enlightening and thought-provoking speeches from this platform. This platform respects the liberty of officials who adorn this platform. Although we may or may not agree with the ideas and thoughts expressed here, however, we support their independence and their constitutional right to express their ideas freely. Through interactions with such luminaries, the Sangh tries to bolster its ideological foundations. This program is a part of that effort. Any glorifying literature, throwing bright sunlight on hitherto unrevealed, ignored, or missed aspects of Baba Sahib Dr. Ambedkar's work is immensely valuable. Again, I invite Dr. Rathod, and we are very happy to have him here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a beautiful information about Satyashodak Maitri Sangha. After this, moving further, with due permission of Akash sir, I would request Swadesh to describe today's event in brief in our mother tongue Marathi and to introduce our honorable speaker of the event.
विचारमंचावरील आजच्या कार्यक्रमाचे प्रमुख वक्ते प्रोफेसर आकाश सिंग सर, सत्यशोधक मैत्री संघाचे प्रतिनिधी मिस्टर सिद्धार्थ आणि मिस्टर सचिन आणि आकाश सिंग यांना ऐकण्यासाठी आलेले आपण सर्वजण मित्र, दरवर्षी जयंतीच्या निमित्ताने सत्यशोधक मैत्री संघ वेगवेगळे उपक्रम राबवत असते. महापुरुषांची जयंती ही नेहमीच वैचारिक पद्धतीने साजरी करण्याकडे आमचा कल राहिलेला आहे. यावर्षी आपण काय करायचं असा विचार सुरू असताना आमचा संपर्क लिहिलेली त्यांची लवकरच एक बिकमिंग बाबासाहेब नावाने बायोग्राफी पब्लिश होत आहे. तेव्हा आम्ही असं ठरवलं की जे बाबासाहेब संपूर्ण जगामध्ये सिम्बॉल ऑफ त्यांच्या पुस्तकाविषयी आपण सगळं अशा आम्हाला जयंतीचा कार्यक्रम खरं म्हणजे चरित्र सणाच्या 6व्या शतकामध्ये झाली. तेव्हा फक्त राजा किंवा राणीची चरित्र लिहिली जायची. माझा हेतू होता की जो इंग्रज असतो तो राजकारणाशी संबंधित किंवा राजा किंवा राणी यांच्या कारकिर्दीशी संबंधित घडत असतो आणि म्हणून त्या ऐतिहासिक माहिती ठेवण्यासाठी इतिहास लिहिण्यासाठी म्हणून चरित्र लेखनाची सुरुवात झाली आणि ती राजा राणीची चरित्र लिहू लागली. चरित्र लेखनाचा हा हेतू क्षणभरासाठी खरा जरी मानला तरी बाबासाहेब मात्र या सगळ्यांना अपवाद ठरतात. ज्या जातीची, ज्या समाजाची हजारो वर्षाच्या इतिहासाने कुठलीही नोंद घेतली नाही अशा जातीत, अशा समाजात जन्मलेल्या बाबासाहेबांनी तो हजारो वर्षाचा गुलामीचा इतिहास तर संपवलाच, पण आपला स्वतःचा एक नवा इतिहास निर्माण केला. जगाच्या अशी खूप कमी उदाहरणे आहेत ज्यामध्ये बाबासाहेब एक आहेत. आणि म्हणून असं अद्वितीय व्यक्तिमत्व असलेल्या बाबासाहेबांच्या आयुष्याचा, त्यांच्या चरित्राचा अभ्यास करणं त्यांचे अनुयायी म्हणून आपल्यासाठी खूप महत्वाचं आहे. चरित्राने आपल्या मनावरती मोठा प्रभाव असतो. महापुरुषांची चरित्र अनेकदा आपल्या आयुष्यामध्ये आमूलाग्र बदल घडवून आणत असतात. बाबासाहेबांनाही त्यांच्या विद्यार्थी दशेमध्ये गौतम बुद्धांचं चरित्र वाचायला मिळालं आणि त्याचा त्याच्या आयुष्यावरती काय परिणाम झाला हे आपल्या सगळ्यांना आहे. चरित्र लेखन करताना लेखकासाठी ते बरेच जबाबदारीचं काम असतं. त्या व्यक्तीच्या आयुष्याबद्दलचं सखोल संशोधन करणं, त्यातली सत्यता शोधणं हे मोठं काम आहे आणि हे काम प्रोफेसर आकाश यांनी खूप जबाबदारीने केलेलं आहे. खूप मोठा आर्कायव्हल डेटाचा रिसर्च करून जवळजवळ 10 वर्ष अभ्यास करून त्यांनी बिकमिंग बाबासाहेब ही बायोग्राफी लिहिली आहे. बाबासाहेबांच्या वैयक्तिक आयुष्यातला स्ट्रगल, विद्यार्थी दशेतील भिवा ते बाबासाहेब हा त्यांचा जो काही प्रवास आहे तो या पुस्तकात त्यांनी खूप सुंदर मांडलेला आहे. प्रोफेसर आकाश सिंग यांच्याबद्दल सांगायचं झालं तर ते एक इंटरनॅशनल फिलॉसॉफर आणि ऑथर आहेत. आतापर्यंत त्यांची 9 पुस्तकं प्रकाशित झालीत. पॉलिटिक्स, फिलॉसॉफी, लॉ, रिलिजन अँड लिटरेचर अशा वेगवेगळ्या विषयावरील डझनभर पुस्तकांचं त्यांनी संपादन केलं आहे. त्यांच्या हेगल्स इंडिया या पुस्तकाला टाटा लिटरेचर अवॉर्डचं नॉमिनेशन देखील मिळालं होतं. बाबासाहेबांवरती त्यांच्या 4 पुस्तकं पब्लिश झालीत. त्यात मोस्ट फेमस बुक आंबेडकर प्रेमल हे देखील आहे. लेखक असण्याबरोबरच ते नामांकित प्रोफेसर देखील आहेत. JNU दिल्ली, युनिव्हर्सिटी ऑफ टोरंटो कॅनडा, हम्बोल्ट युनिव्हर्सिटी बर्लिन, लुईस युनिव्हर्सिटी रोम अशा मोस्ट फेमस युनिव्हर्सिटीज मध्ये त्यांनी अध्यापनाचं काम केलेलं आहे. ही इज इंटरनॅशनल फेलो ॲट इथोस रोम अँड फेलो ऑफ इंडियन इन्स्टिट्यूट ॲडव्हान्स्ड शिमला. बियॉन्ड द पेन, Akash is top ranking triathlete also. Akash, with such a versatile personality, is present among us today. Many times we read biographies, but if we get the experience to understand that biography from the author who wrote it, it will be the great experience. And today we all are going to get that experience. And for this, students and professionals from the district of Maharashtra like Pune, Nanded, Aurangabad, Yavatmal have come to listen to Akash. And also my friends from Punjab and Hyderabad also come to that event. And you all are eager for the Akash Singh. So without taking much time, I will stop here. Thank you Satyashodhak Maitri Sangha to giving me this opportunity, and thank you all for listening to me. Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much, Mr. Swadesh, for such a nice information about Akash Singh. I know You all are eagerly waiting to hear Mr. Akash Singh. Even I am also. So without delaying further, I will immediately call Mr. Akash Singh. Please come and address us about your recently published book, Becoming Baba Saheb from Birth to Mahad. Let us heartily welcome to Professor Akash Singh.
JB, good morning. Now, I begin first with an apology. My family has been working very, very hard to get me to speak Marathi. After 20 years, I should have succeeded more than I have, but at least I've gotten to the reading stage, which for me is a great delight. I think if I spoke, it would be a great misery for all of you, so I will stick to English. First of all, of course, I have to thank the Satyashodak Maitri Sangh, quite a remarkable organization, one that pursues its interests with such obvious sincerity and dedication. It was stated that the Sangh is more important than the individual. And I think that shows very much in this organization, in this Sangh. I will say, those of you who know me know I always present a counterpoint of view, that the Sangh is also a collection of individuals, and the individuals then should also be recognized for the work that they contribute to the Sangh. But one without the other, of course, creates many problems. Both together, I think, is the reason for the success of this Sangh. So it's my great pleasure to be with you. There are many ways that we can talk about the way that the life of Dr. Ambedkar has been treated by biographers. We can discuss it from a local point of view with the Marathi biographies. We can even discuss it beyond script with the oral traditions. And of course, in my field, in academia, we can discuss the biographies produced by kind of scholars and historians and so on. There are only two dimensions where the personality of Baba Saheb is really in focus. It has never been with academia. It has only been in the oral tradition and the way that that oral tradition was in fact captured in one particular book, which is Savita Ambedkar's autobiography, a narrative that was narrated in person to our great friend and mentor, Vijay Surwada, and then produced as a book, but a book that has always been social in a community that has never been fully convinced of her bona fides, let's say. Even if we step aside, step beyond that dispute about Savita Ambedkar's role, contribution, intentions, and so on, nevertheless, she only presents the period that they were married, so a 9-year period, which means that in literature, in writing, not in the oral tradition, we have almost no possibility for discovering what Baba Saheb was like as a person, the kind of personal struggles, what we can call the interior life of this man, who for all of us is larger than life. Now, we all need people to model ourselves on. We all need exemplars, mentors, so we know the direction to follow, the footsteps that we should follow in, the direction that we should prepare for our own lives and for our children's lives. So it's it's not a bad thing that Dr. Ambedkar has been so idolized, that he's been placed on a pedestal, because we need someone, especially with this kind of integrity, to be there on the pedestal to guide us. But at the same time, there has always been a distance that gets created. In other words, there was only one Baba Sahib. But is that what Baba Sahib would want the world to be like? Rather, we know that he would want there to be many. If we keep him on this pedestal only, how is it that any of us, our future generations, can follow that path in a manner that we think, I could also achieve that. I could also do these things. And what I've tried to do in this book, from Ambedkar's preamble, which gets into the mind, the amazing encyclopedic mind of Ambedkar, to tell us what he thought, almost in a manner that so surprising, I don't know how anyone could think these things. But I want to step beyond that and discover in this book, well, how did he come to be a person who could use the preamble to the Constitution? How did he come to be that man in flesh and blood? Which means charting out the path of Biva Ambedkar into Bhimrao Ambedkar, into Bhimrao Ambedkar, bar at law, into Dr. Ambedkar, into Baba Sahib. These are stages of his growth from the smallest age to the era of his recognized accomplishments and, of course, idolization. It's not possible to answer how is it that one becomes Baba Sahib in a fully convincing way, because this is a mystery of human life. How do you get a man or a woman of this particular genius in a particular moment in time? If you look at the parent, the lineage, the brothers and sisters, son, nephew, and so on. So if you look at it from the genetic point of view, you can't necessarily expect Baba Sahib Ambedkar to arise. If you look at it from the historical point of view, you can't necessarily expect an Ambedkar to arise. If you could, there would have been more. If you look at it at the sociological point of view, you would never expect an Ambedkar to arrive. And so what we have to do is start to understand all of the layers that come to work simultaneously to produce the possibility of being Baba Sahib. And that's what I've tried to do in the book. But as we all know, the sources that we have available for us are very conflicting. They're very contradictory at times. Some will say that some event happened, others will say it didn't happen. If you're familiar with Eleanor Zeliot's writings, she's done a wonderful job looking at sources, but there's one interview she conducted who mentioned that a certain temple satyagraha in fact never happened, one that we all read about and try to see Dr. Ambedkar's role in that. So, you know, some people say events never happened that we believe have happened. On the other hand, there are events that we believe have happened that in fact never happened. And one of those is, of course, a supposed or alleged relationship between Savarkar and Ambedkar. Complete fiction, a complete fiction, and yet not only do Ambedkar biographies carry on this fiction, relying on bad sources, but even Savarkar biographies biographers carry on this fiction. So there are some events that may have happened that are said not to have happened, and there are many things that never happened that are said to have happened. And the literature is full of these kinds of contradictions. Of course, the oral tradition is also, while it taps into some resources that are not available in the academic traditions, it also, over time, like all oral traditions, began to introduce new evidence, things that things that attempt to aggrandize the reputation, I shouldn't use such a complicated language, that try to build up the reputation of Dr. Ambedkar in the community. Of course, that was necessary over the decades, but I think it's not necessary now. We all know what sort of a person he was and what he accomplished. This is spreading now throughout the world. So we have, with due respect to oral tradition, with due respect to the Marathi literature, even with some respect, a little less, to the academic literature on Dr. Ambedkar, we are, in the present day, flooded with misinformation, disinformation, and it's very difficult to separate the fact from the fiction. Personally, as I began by saying, I see a great deal of value in idolization of this person. I see a great deal of value of even exaggeration in some respects, because we all need a kind of idol, a path to follow. On the other hand, it is also important, as Dr. Ambedkar becomes a global icon, and not just a Maharashtrian or an Indian or a South Asian or an Asian or an Eastern. He is a global, he's emerging on the global stage today in a very, very big way. It is important at precisely this moment to separate the fact from the fiction. Now, I'm going to go very briefly into a very different scenario from today, where Dr. Ambedkar is emerging as a global icon. I myself grew up in the same neighborhood where Dr. Ambedkar was studying in New York City, and at the same university, Columbia University. I myself was later at London School of Economics, just the same as Dr. Ambedkar. And I myself studied law, the same as Dr. Ambedkar. Now, can you imagine, with this many overlaps, that I had never even heard the name Ambedkar until must be 25 years ago now. So let's say right around the year 2000. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible? Because of a shortage of information that had transcended local communities on the one hand, and because of a suppression of information that was available for the international communities. Now the camera is on, so I can't say exactly who is responsible for that suppression, because our government does in fact have something to do with that, but I won't discuss that now. You all know very well. Thankfully, I happened to encounter a wonderful person in Berlin right around that time, now my wife. And the first time I went to her house, which was in Berlin, she was in the Foreign Service and she was working at the Embassy of India in Berlin. I was teaching at the university in Berlin, and we met there. First time I went to her house, I saw a wonderful picture of Baba Saheb in her drawing room. And I asked, who is that? Is that your grandfather? And do you know what her answer was? Yes. Very curious, but very confusing for me, because for some time, I thought this was her biological grandfather. She meant it, of course, that she wouldn't be who she is without him. From that moment, I received a quick education in Dr. Ambedkar, who he was, what he meant. Now, some of you know my father-in-law, so it was also a rough education. He did not tolerate any failure of memory or failure of attention on my part. The only thing he has tolerated is my poor Marathi till now. But he will probably start to enforce that after, since this book has come out. Now we've moved from an era where someone who was in all of the same places as Dr. Ambedkar and pursuing the same academic career in the same institutions can ignorantly be blind to who he was and what he accomplished, to an era where if anyone is at those institutions, they will make you know that this is where Dr. Ambedkar studied. You'll see the statues, the portraits at Columbia, you'll see them in London, you'll see them at LSE, you'll see them all over the world now, even in Berlin, in Germany, in Heidelberg, in Bonn, in many other places. That change is a product essentially of different streams, two different kinds of momentum. One is very sincere, and that is the hard work of activists, intellectual activists, academic activists from the larger Dalit diaspora who reservation have been able to get an education that gives them the possibility to work and compete on the global job market. Obviously, that didn't exist when I was a child. So while I feel ashamed of not knowing Ambedkar when I was at Columbia and LSE and so on, in my defense, the shame belongs to the lack of reservation and education that would allow people to go and spread that word. The second is not so sincere movement internationally. And this we refer to sometimes as the appropriation of Dr. Ambedkar by interests of the left and the right to take advantage of the rightful legacy, patrimony, the rightful inheritance of the Dalit community, to take advantage of that and to try to profit in some way off of it. So I can give you the simple, but I this needs to go to a Dalit. You don't call me, you call a Dalit scholar. They accepted my refusal and they immediately hired a Brahmin. And since that day, in the last 10 years of the Dr. Ambedkar chair functioning at Columbia University, his alma mater, who claims to be so proud of him, there have been 10 so-called, or we can say more accurately, oppressor caste academics filling that chair. Only one Dalit in more than a decade. I don't want to be pessimistic or bring down a day of celebration like this, but we have to be cautious that as much as there is for celebration in the globalization of Ambedkar, there are also flags that we have to redouble our efforts. When it comes to sincerity, pursuing the goals of the Sangh, pursuing self-respect and improvement of ourselves as individuals along the model of Dr. Ambedkar, we have to be cautious that all along the way, there are appropriators and there are hazards. And these are not going to decrease as Dr. Ambedkar gets more and more recognized. I tell you, as someone who spends most of his life in different parts of the world, these are only going to increase now. The more Dr. Ambedkar becomes global, the more we are happy in our hearts. And yet, the more we have to be cautious of the dangers of appropriation, because institutions, academic institutions, research centers, publishers, publishing houses, all of these institutions are economic institutions. And the wealth that is created through an Ambedkar industry, the globalization of Ambedkar, this wealth will not equally be distributed. Like all other institutions in this country, wealth will be distributed to those who already have it. And in this respect, you can see my example of the Ambedkar Chair at Columbia University, giving this prestigious chair who belong to communities which historically oppressed Dr. Ambedkar, which historically wanted him excluded from the university and so on. So we have simultaneously celebration, but we must remain cautious. Now I'm going to talk about this twofold thing, but more on the celebration. Today I published an article in the Deccan Herald called Happy Birthday Ambedkar. Here is a bouquet of books. Now, this bouquet of books is something that is very delightful. There have, in the last 6 months only, 6 months, been 6 new books about Dr. Ambedkar, various aspects of his life published. That means 1 book per month to this great man. Can you imagine after? And of course, these are all international, big international publishers. Publishers that 30 years ago would never have been interested in this. So it's a huge cause for celebration. You all know the book by Scott Stroud, I believe, on Ambedkar and Dewey. This explores Dr. Ambedkar's time in New York and what he learned from John Dewey, the great teacher, great educator, great philosopher. And this kind of exploration of the relationship or the impact that Dewey had on Ambedkar has been missing from all Ambedkar scholarship, going all the way back to Karmade, who was very sincere in his efforts, but who couldn't understand these very academic kinds of relationships between a professor and a student and the kind of impact this might have on one's work and writing and so on. And Keir, Dhananjay Keir, who also misunderstood these things. I'm not sure if as sincerely as Karmade or just because he couldn't be bothered, but that's another issue. So Scott Stroud's work sheds such important light on an aspect of Dr. Ambedkar that was so important to Dr. Ambedkar himself, his time in New York and how that left a lasting impression. And at the same time, you can pair that with a new book called Ambedkar in London. And Ambedkar in London, just like Scott shows Ambedkar in New York, Ambedkar in London talks about the influence that his period in London had on Ambedkar's life. That's part 1. And part 2, which is particularly delightful, shows the later influence that Dr. Ambedkar had on London. And this is very nice because it celebrates the way that Ambedkar's presence in London didn't just change him, but it changed London. And this is a very important aspect to capture. So these 2 books have come out. Then there are 2 other books that I would mention. One is Intellectual Biography by Ashok Gopal. What is the title of it? Apart. This biography, I think many of you have bought today. It's a very comprehensive look at the thought, the ideas of Dr. Ambedkar in a manner that hasn't been done before, certainly not in English, and certainly not by a major, what is now a major international publisher. So this is also a cause for celebration. You can pair Ashok Gopal's intellectual biography, I think, with my own biography, will be equally comprehensive when the second volume comes out, covering all of Dr. Ambedkar's life. But here we focus on the personality of Dr. Ambedkar rather than the intellectual aspect. I do discuss Dr. Ambedkar's writings, his speeches, his journal articles, and so on, quite carefully and systematically. But you will notice that the reason for discussing them is not to talk about them, it's to talk about what they say about who he was. So if I'm going to discuss his PhD thesis, for example, of particular relevance is, of course, the dedication. What does the dedication say about who he recognized as being the condition for allowing him to become Dr. Ambedkar? Of course, the Gaikwad and his parents, his first two dedications in his first two books. If I'm going to discuss his journal articles, I'm going to show not what it was that he said and how brilliant and interesting it was, but what it reflects about his mood at the time, his feelings at the time, what he was going through at the time. So while in my biography, I go through all of the work, the literature, the writing, the speeches, the debates of Dr. Ambedkar, I do so in a manner to try to shed light on who he was, as opposed to on what he said. Whereas Gopal is the opposite. And I think I have a photo of these 4 book covers, which is quite lovely, but I won't be able to show it very, very large. So yeah, it's pointless for me to show. Then there are two more to mention, the last 2 of these 6. One is, I've already mentioned, Savita Ambedkar's autobiography, which has been translated into English now by Nadeem Khan. Now, many of you have probably already seen the Marathi version, has existed for several decades. There's something about bringing that back to show the flesh and blood Ambedkar as a family man, Ambedkar as supporting a family, the trials and the difficulties that we face in the family. And even such a man as accomplished as Dr. Ambedkar, as a minister in the government, as a barrister, as a great writer, great orator, and having achieved so much, still he has to struggle day to day financially because of the way that Brahmin, especially Brahmin lawyers, have undermined his legal practice, the way that his ideological enemies have undermined the possibility for him to accumulate any wealth or steady position and so on. And whatever money he did manage to gain in his lifetime, entirely spent on books in order to make a library for his community, in order to establish a library. And it turns out to be one of the 3 greatest libraries ever established in India. So whatever meager earnings he did make, he spent, of course, on his books and with the wider aim of the community. But this intimate portrait is very, very significant because it humanizes Dr. Ambedkar in a way. And on the complete opposite spectrum, the last book I pair with that is Shashi Tharoor's biography, which is, talk about, my immediate reaction was to be upset, annoyed by this work. But to be very honest, as a person, this man, Shashi Tharoor, has always been very kind with me, so I have trouble. Even though I want to dislike him, I can't. It's just something that won't happen. But so I try to look at the good side of this biography, and I realize there is one there is one special merit to Shashi Tharoor's biography, and that is that since Kanchiram, we have not actually had a statesman evaluate a greater statesman. So in this respect, at least we get a view that I think none of us in this room really could have on our own, which is, what does a statesman think about this giant statesman, Dr. Ambedkar? And while as a biography and so on, it might not be, very informative, introducing this angle, again, no statesman has done such a thing since Kanchiram. This is something that we can get from that biography. So I've listed 6 new books come out in the last 6 months that I think are a kind of birthday gift for the Ambedkar celebrations. But I want to, once again, lower the mood a little bit, because with every aspect of celebration, as I mentioned, we have to be cautious. I wanted to show you book covers of these 6 books. I'll just rename them. There's Savita Ambedkar's autobiography, which is called, in the English translation, Baba Sahib, which I paired with Shashi Tharoor's biography of Dr. Ambedkar called A Life. There is my own biography, Becoming Baba Sahib, which I paired sort of with or against Ashok Gopal's Apart. There's Scott Stroud's book on Ambedkar in New York, The Dewey Years, and then there's the Jafar Lowell book on Ambedkar in London. These 6 books. What do these 6 books have in common other than their subject matter of Dr. Ambedkar? You will be too polite. You'll be too polite to say the answer if you know it. But think, reflect, what do these 6 books have in common other than that they have Dr. Ambedkar as their subject matter? Sir? I wouldn't say that. I mean, I understand why you're saying, but I wouldn't say that. Remember, this is on the side of caution. The community needs to be cautious about this. What? All by non-Dalits. Who said? Okay, thank you so much. The 6 books by great, important, powerful international publishers. We're all very pleased. And of course, I don't want too much critique because I'm included. But how can this be? We have to remain vigilant. This cannot continue to be. It does tell us one thing, which is that all of the advances that have been made, and there are so many, we see them in this room. All of the advances that have been made, nevertheless, there is a thread that runs through from beginning to end, which is that there's always a risk of appropriation if we do not remain constantly vigilant and constantly alert. Now, I don't mean we should become cynical, but we have to be alert, and we have to then to move from the gloom to more proactive, what we can do about it. We have to assemble our in order to ensure that the next 6 books are by Dalit authors, are by people from the community itself. Now, this is a group of activists who are also intellectuals. And this is a wonderful combination because for the most part, you have activists who are a little short on ideas, who don't read and so on, or you have intellectuals who know nothing about the ground realities. And so when they merge, this is a beautiful and fortunate thing to happen. But we also need to ensure that some part of the ground realities do not put so much pressure on Dalit intellectuals that they do not have the solitude and the resources to sit and do kind of intellectual work that can compete at the international level. You know, Dr. Ambedkar's time in the library, in his study, was his most precious time, and it was his respite, where he went for refuge when things became too hectic outside. Everyone here is familiar with his time in Baroda. Of course, it's my position that you're not completely familiar with exactly what happened, and that's why I try to, redesign some of the facts about his time in Baroda in the book. But we all know at least how he was treated, how he was mistreated, despite what great accomplishments he had already achieved and what a high level he was appointed to. He was treated with indignity and humiliation. But there's a lesson there. Where did he go for refuge in Baroda? To the library. Every day when he was mistreated at the government office, he went to the library to seek refuge in his books and his reading and so on. So the harsh realities of the day, he could find some refuge. And had the library allowed him to sleep at night, his experience in Baroda would have been a pleasant one rather than the trauma that it was. He mentions that whenever he thinks of it, tears come to his eyes. So there's something sacred space about the library, the study, that allows a person to get some freedom from the busyness of the day. Now, as activists, you are fully engaged in politics, the ground realities, but you too need to step back and to meditate or to contemplate or to whatever it is that you do to recenter yourself. And I think as a Buddhist organization or body, you know the value of this, that one must enter deeply into oneself to replenish oneself for engaging once again with the world. Now, I evaluate that much of the problem of why the Dalit authors have not been able to produce the literature that is much more easily produced by the non-Dalit authors. We all know the institutional reasons: exclusion, prejudice, discrimination. But the less known, I think, is this aspect of the inability to find that quiet space. You know, Virginia Woolf had written a book called A Room of One's Own at the time of the women's movement in the UK and USA. She wrote this very, very fascinating book that what women don't have is a room of their own where they can have that solitude and gain, read and study and gain the kind of internal resources to go out in the world and fight. And I'm going to come back to why that's important in a moment. But I think one of the undiagnosed aspects is, of course, how it is that Dalit intellectuals, even activist intellectuals, academics, can find the space and the support, the resources to pursue research. This is one thing that I myself am going to start working on. I have never accepted any royalties or money that comes from any book that I write about Dr. Ambedkar. That's not true for other books that I write. That I happily take that money. But with books, any of my 4 previous books where Dr. Ambedkar is in focus, this money always goes to schools, to Anuttam Khobragade Foundation for helping children to, especially Dalit girls, to complete their education. But what I propose to do now, from the proceeds of this book, and I'm finding now cause for celebration that it has been #1 for the last 2-3 days, and in the top 10 of all books in India. So I think there will be some money coming from it. What I plan to do, instead of putting it where I normally do, I want to create a kind of scholarship or fellowship for Dalit writers to support them with books and an office and basically the time and space where they can begin to study all of the new literature And in fact, there's not even that much study they need to do, because from my experience with Dalit intellectuals and activists, the knowledge is all there. The only thing that is not there is the time and the circumstances to get it out. So what I would propose to do is to try to address this, and I would like your support for undertaking this. Now, a final moment to mention why I think it's of particular significance. As I attempt to correct the historical record, there's one thing that I think you might find interesting, especially the ladies who are present here. It has become fashionable to tie Dr. Ambedkar and his struggle to his cooperation with the Black movement when he was in New York City, the Harlem Renaissance, as it was called, the time when Black Americans were gaining a kind of consciousness of their civil and political rights. And for example, the letter exchanged between W.E.B. Du Bois or Dubois and Ambedkar is given as evidence of this. But that letter is from the 1940s. So what is the reality when Dr. Ambedkar was in New York, 1913 to 1916, of his experience with Black America? As far as I can find, the reality is he had almost none. And this despite the film Ambedkar, otherwise very wonderful film, where Ambedkar is given this Black friend in Harlem who, pals around with him and shows him the Black experience. This is all fiction. None of that ever happened. But where is it that Dr. Ambedkar acquired the kind of symbiotic or cooperative energy and understanding about transforming a personal and community struggle into a political struggle, into not just an articulation of our personal concerns, but moving it into a civil and political phenomenon. It was not from the Black movement in New York. Harlem was not Black Harlem at that time. It was mostly white. It was from the women's suffrage movement. It was from the women in New York at that moment when Dr. Ambedkar was there, who were daily marching for their rights, for the right to vote specifically, which came shortly after Ambedkar left the United States. It was the women's suffrage movement which filled the auditoriums at Columbia University, which filled the classroom conversation of the likes of John Dewey, Ambedkar's teacher, and other professors that Dr. Ambedkar had and supervisors that he had at Columbia. So we have, interestingly, the women's suffrage movement to thank as a model and resource for a young Ambedkar when he was at Columbia University, for a manner of transforming all of his ideas and experiences into a model for how to move those onto the political realm to deal with civic and political issues at the government level. Now, of course, there had been many movements before. We all know Phule's impact on Ambedkar and so on, but I'm referring to the American side of this, which is mistakenly believed to be an inspiration from the Black community, when the true inspiration was the women's community. This is why I brought up Virginia Woolf and the Room of One's Own, and tying it to how we need our Dalit intellectuals also to have a kind of room of their own, so that the next 6 books that come out, giving us fresh insights about the life and times of Babasaheb Ambedkar, are authored by people of Ambedkar's legacy. Now, the last thing I'll say is to talk about a few of the things that we don't know, because I think this is it's very exciting As I mentioned, my knowledge goes back only 20 years, but any of you who is older than 20, your knowledge goes back that many more years, right? And yet a lot of this knowledge is misinformation. And there are just a few things that I think are worth mentioning because to me, they mean a lot. I mean, I find them so fascinating. I think people don't realize that the original scholarship that Dr. Ambedkar had to study from the Gaikwad was not to go to New York, it was to go to London. Are you aware of that? His original scholarship was to go to London and to study education, a degree in education. The way I discovered this was because when you see the actual agreement between Dr. Ambedkar and the state of Baroda, it states that Dr. Ambedkar will go to Columbia University not to study education. And I thought, what a strange letter to sign. Why should I sign an agreement? I'm going there to not do something. And so I had to figure out why did that come. And of course, you know how bureaucrats write things. They just look at the file, the previous file, and they build up. So that's why the document became written like this, that Dr. Ambedkar will go to New York, to Columbia University in New York City for a period of 2 years, not to study pedagogy. So if you go back through the files, which are in the Baroda State Archive, you find that the period of 2 years on the topic of education was precisely because that's what the other students had been doing. And Dr. Ambedkar said that he didn't want to do this. And of course, the Gaikwad didn't want Ambedkar to do this either because he had every intention of making Dr. Ambedkar his finance minister when he returned back from Columbia. So this is an interesting thing. Also, we find on the agreement signed between Dr. Ambedkar and the state of Baroda, one thing that I think might be interesting for all of you, because we all know that the statues, the statuaries, the portraits, every time we represent Baba Sahib, how do we represent him? Dressed very elegantly. But where did this come from? I mean, I don't dress elegantly anyway. He is always perfect, right? But have you ever asked yourself where did this come from? We know why he did it. Self-respect, to contrast himself from the Khadi and Gandhi and all of this fake kind of Swadesh, so we know why, we know how, but when did it begin? There we find a secret that in this agreement between Ambedkar and the state is an outfit allowance. And this outfit allowance specifies to buy a suit suitable for the joining at Columbia University. Very aristocratic place, right? Columbia, everybody dressed fine. It is this moment when Dr. Ambedkar receives what they call a bursary, an amount of money for the purchasing of a suit. From that moment in 1913 till the rest of his life, you can see this love, this I don't want to say attachment, this whatever is a good word for that, this orientation towards dressing in this way. So I think this is a wonderful part of the becoming Baba Sahib story that has never been seen before. There are details now that I have about how much money Dr. Ambedkar was short when he was in London finally and had to return back to Bombay because he couldn't continue his education. And I think this is a cause for some sadness on all of our parts. It is precisely 5,250 rupees. If Dr. Ambedkar had 5,250 rupees in 1920, he never would have had to come back to to Bombay. He could have stayed on in London and finished his thesis, PhD, and complete before returning. Now, Dhananjay Kheer has suggested, and Khairmodeh has repeated, that on Ambedkar's first return to Bombay from New York, there was a great celebration for his educational achievements, and that Dr. Ambedkar didn't attend and said, there's nothing special about my education, and therefore give the money that's raised to a young depressed classes student so they can have an education such as mine. But the reality is that, and I'll say now, Ambedkar did not attend that celebration because he was not Dr. Ambedkar. They were felicitating him for being Dr. Ambedkar, and he was not. He was simply Ambedkar. He had not received the actual PhD at that moment. This is the reason he did not attend the event. And it was, he did not want to come and fool the crowd, the community, and he also did not want to come and disappoint them. And so I think this lack of 5,250 rupees, it's not just a historical accident. It was a significant thing for that Dr. Ambedkar felt, that he returned to India a second time without having achieved the thing that he went to achieve. And it was not only he who made sacrifices, no food, all of the troubles that he faced, the hardships, but also his family. And in some ways, his wife and children, or at that point, child, who may have been children if he had the money, we don't know, who had to suffer, for this. So young Ambedkar's return twice to India without having achieved that title was something that, to his own personal life was very significant. I'm going to name three other things that I find interesting that I've discovered that are incorrectly stated in Kheer and Khairmodeh. Very briefly, since I see people moving in their chairs. One is the rejection of Dr. Ambedkar's DSc thesis from London School of Economics. Kheer has claimed, Khairmodeh has repeated, that the thesis was rejected because of the imperialist orientation of the readers. This is very clearly not the reason that the thesis was rejected. I don't know if people will find the reason that the thesis was objected to be a disappointment. But I can tell you, as an academic, that it's actually a cause for great celebration. Now, the real reason is that it was the ideas that Dr. Ambedkar set out. Now, any doctoral student whose thesis gets rejected on the first time because of what you have said is going to be sad. But see it from my perspective, someone who teaches doctoral students. I have had 30 doctoral students now. All of them write, unless I can push them out of it, very ordinary things, very unoriginal things, things that they know is going to pass without problem. What Dr. Ambedkar had done was to disagree at his young age with every single economist, including John Maynard Keynes, greatest economist of 20th century. Every single one of them saying, they're all wrong, I'm right. Okay, now to be rejected for that, I think is something to be proud of, because I don't have any doctoral students who are willing to take that much risk and that much conviction in their originality and their opinions. So I get into the real reasons behind the rejection in the book. Secondly, once again, Kheer has stated and Khairmodeh has repeated that when Dr. Ambedkar came back and he started practicing law in Bombay, he joined the appellate side of the Bombay High Court instead of the original side. So the original side means there are many advocates here. You enter the court and you fight the case primarily on the facts, in discovery of facts. And then the case is decided on questions of law in relation to what the facts were. And then if you need to appeal, you appeal. But when you appeal, you can't dispute the facts. Those have already been discovered unless it's a mistrial. You dispute on questions of law, the law not being properly applied. And what the previous biographers have all stated, 100% of them, is that the reason that Dr. Ambedkar joined the appellate side was because of the casteism in the original side, and he couldn't make any money there. But if you look back, Dr. Ambedkar couldn't make money on the appellate side either. There was no distinction. He was excluded from both. It's the same Brahmin lawyers who control the original side as control the appellate side. So that's not an argument. The real reason was because of an unknown traineeship that Dr. Ambedkar had while he was in London with a certain Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Ramsey ran a law firm in London specializing in the appellate side, and Dr. Ambedkar spent a year with him working exclusively on appellate cases, and that's where he felt most confident. There's also an intellectual attraction, because many of you who are advocates know that, of course, working an appeal is intellectually stimulating, whereas working an original case is very laborious, time-consuming, collecting facts. And we all know that Dr. Ambedkar liked to read and study and so on. And the appellate side appealed to his intelligence, his intellectual orientation. But the real reason is because of his training in London, and that has never come out before, and I explain how and why that was. A third thing is about the MSc, Master of Science degree. A Master of Science degree is a degree that Ambedkar won and earned with great struggle. Took him 2 trips to London to earn this. And yet, after 1927, there's not a single document that exists where Dr. Ambedkar writes that he had a Master of Science. This is a puzzle. So I've taken a lot of time, so I won't go into it now. You can find the answer to this puzzle in the book, and I think the answer to many other little mysteries like this. But it wasn't solving mysteries necessarily that I was pursuing. It was understanding the exemplar of Baba Sahib, how he became Baba Sahib, and I think step by step as a model for how the rest of us might someday, walking that path, achieve something similar for this great community. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. With the permission of honorable dignitaries present on the dais, I am going to lead the next remaining program. डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांच्या बाबतीत आयुष्याला धरून, त्यांच्या आयुष्याला धरून, त्यांच्या कार्याला धरून बरंच काही सर बोललेत, पण आपण आपल्या भाषणात सुभेदार रामजी आंबेडकरांच्या प्रशस्त शिकवणुकीतून बाळ भीमाचा भीमराव 18 तास अभ्यास करून परदेशी शिकून डॉक्टर भीमराव कसे बनलेत आणि वर्ण व्यवस्थेचे बसणारे चटके अनुभवून ते अनुभव करताना त्यांनी केलेले समाजोद्धारक महत् कार्य, हे सर्व करताना डॉक्टर भीमराव आंबेडकरांचे आदरणीय बाबासाहेब असा त्यांचा अद्वितीय जीवन प्रवास काही गोष्टी ठळक करून प्रोफेसर आकाश सरांनी यथोचित मांडण्याचा प्रयत्न केलाय. डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकरांच्या जीवनावर प्रकाश टाकून आपण बाबासाहेबांना समजावून सांगितले, त्याबद्दल धन्यवाद आकाश सर. हजारो वर्षांची गुलामगिरी आणि वर्णव्यवस्थेमुळे ज्या समाजातील एका वर्गास हीन बनवले गेले, त्यांना ताठ मानेने स्वातंत्र्य, समता आणि बंधुतेने जगण्याचा संदेश दिला. अशा वर्णव्यवस्थेवर सडेतोड भाष्य करणारे कर्ते समाज सुधारक महात्मा ज्योतिबा फुले, आरक्षणाचे जनक छत्रपती शाहू महाराज, तद्वतच
संविधान निर्माते विश्वरत्न डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर यांनी चालविलेला विचारांचा वारसा जपण्याचे कार्य सत्यशोधक मैत्री संघ कसोशीने प्रयत्न करतोय. आपण सुद्धा आम्हास असे जोडून महामानवांनी चालविलेला वारसा आणि त्यांनी पाहिलेल्या स्वप्नातील स्वातंत्र्य, समता आणि मैत्री या तत्वावर आधारित आदर्श समाज घडवण्याचा या प्रक्रियेत आपणही जोडून राहाल याची मी आपल्याकडून अपेक्षा करतो. Now moving towards the most interesting question answer session. Now I invite all audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hands. Also, please note Dr. Akash sir can take questions in Hindi too.
Hello sir. Hello sir. I do have two questions. One is factual one, and one is little philosophical one. We do read that Babasaheb
to explain what the issue is. The real issue for me is there's a fundamental anachronism. In other words, the evidence for the name being given comes from a registration book at the very school where that name was to be given. Now, any of us who is registered for a class, you register before you enter. So this makes no sense that the evidence for the name change should be on the registration book of where it occurred. However, Dr. Ambedkar's own later accounts in editorials of the newspaper that he himself edited state very clearly that this was what happened. So I don't want to I don't want to say that Dr. Ambedkar has not corrected what he has himself written. And consequently, I can't come down one way or another on this. But I think that there's still a mystery there. There's still a mystery there because it doesn't make sense, and yet Ambedkar himself said that it happened. So this is not something that I make a decision about, but I do go through the fact that it's not simple, it's not resolved. There is an ambiguity there. There's also an ambiguity in your second question, even though it's more about ideas rather than facts. I myself have been an activist in the past. With the camera rolling, I can't give the details because but it has involved things for which I get into trouble with the government and so on. And from that point of view, it is extremely important to stay hopeful even if from the other point of view, when we observe what's happening, the undeclared emergency, as we can call it, that we are experiencing today. But that undeclared emergency is, of course, hitting all of the communities. There has been an emergency for this community for many, many decades prior. And I think you're right that the hope in Kanshiram's movement was undermined. And we look today at the political realities that 70 SC, members of parliament in a party that has as one of its fundamental ideological ambitions to undermine and destroy this community. Keep that in mind, that your predecessors, who are your inspiration, had it just as bad, if not worse than you. And they are your predecessors, your inspiration for a reason, because despite that, they achieved. And so even in these dark times, there's always that as a lantern of hope.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I can ask a question. I may take a little more time just to explain my question. So we are my intro. Yeah, I'm Dr. Pritank Manvatkar. I'm a teacher at this college. I teach political science, and I'm also a part of a band called Bodhakaru. We try to spread Ambedkar culture. So, sharing with all of you. And thank you very much to Satyashodak Maitri Sangha for organizing this wonderful and much needed discussion, for initiating this discussion on this very important book. Thank you to Professor Akash for explaining and for telling us what is there in the book and having this discussion. So first of all, thank you, and especially thank you मैं थोड़ा हिंदी में बात करता हूँ. उसके लिए बहुत बहुत साधुवाद जो आपने बात कहा कि जिससे आप ऐसी स्टूडेंट्स को हेल्प करना चाहते हैं यहाँ पर कि जो पढ़ना चाहते हैं लिखना चाहते हैं उनके लिए स्पेस क्रिएट करने के लिए, उसके लिए बहुत बहुत साधुवाद और थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर स्पीकिंग दैट आउट। मेरा क्वेश्चन यहाँ पर एप्रोप्रिएशन से जुड़ा हुआ है। आपने जो भी बोला मैं कंप्लीटली एग्री करता हूँ। एक पर्टिकुलर कम्युनिटी है जो एप्रोप्रिएट किए जा रहा है थॉट, एंड नॉट ओनली दैट, आई रिमेम्बर प्रोफेसर गुरु टीचिंग अस कि वो होता है इट इज theoretical brahmins and empirical shudras, तो उसको वैसे ही लेके गया है, ये एक लीगेसी आई है। और यहाँ पर जब हम लोग उसको ब्रेक कर रहे हैं उस वाले लीगेसी को, तो ये सच में बहुत कॉन्ग्रेचुलेटरी है हमारे लिए कि हम लोग भी अभी लिखेंगे और उस पूरे लीगेसी को चैलेंज करेंगे। पर साथ ही साथ मुझे ऐसा और लगता है कि हमारा जो आइडेंटिटी है वो हमारे बर्थ के ऊपर ही डिटरमाइन नहीं करता। अगर मैं किसी कास्ट में पैदा हुआ हूँ, उसको मैं ट्रांसेंड करता जा रहा हूँ, और बिकमिंग बाबा साहेब में भी हम ये देखते हैं, बीइंग इज बिकमिंग। तो व्हाट इज दैट बिकमिंग? इज इट ओनली रिलेटेड टू द कास्ट इन व्हिच आई एम बॉर्न? क्या मैं उसको लेके चलते जाऊं? और इसीलिए मैं अपने राइटिंग्स में, हम अपने परफॉर्मेंसेस में, हम दलित कैटेगरी जो है उसको भी रिजेक्ट कर रहे हैं, और हम लोग खुद को अम्बेडकराइट बोल रहे हैं, बुद्धिस्ट बोल रहे हैं। तो इसको देखते हुए मेरा ये सवाल रहेगा कि क्या कोई शेड्यूल कास्ट कैटेगरी में पैदा हुआ व्यक्ति बाबा साहेब को अप्रोप्रिएट नहीं कर सकता? फिर और एक सवाल आता है कि क्या सिर्फ शेड्यूल कास्ट में, मैं भी शेड्यूल कास्ट हूं, तो शेड्यूल कास्ट के ही लोगों को बाबा साहेब पे बोलने का, लिखने का हक है? क्या हम डू वी ओन बाबा साहेब? ये एक मेरा सवाल आता है, जस्ट शेयरिंग माय थिंकिंग। और स्पेशली जब मैं ये देखता हूं कि शेड्यूल कास्ट का भी व्यक्ति बाबा साहेब के थॉट्स को डिस्टॉर्ट कर सकता है। बाबा साहब का एक थॉट है, वो है, उन्होंने लिखा हुआ है, बट एक शेड्यूल कास्ट का व्यक्ति, मैंने भी पढ़ा लिखा हूं, मैंने भी पीएचडी किया, और मैंने इतना पोटेंशियल गेन कर लिया कि मैं अपने वर्ड से बाबा साहब के आइडियाज को डिस्टॉर्ट कर सकता हूँ, और उसके बाद में मेरा कोई पढ़ेगा तो उसको लगेगा कि अच्छा ये तो कुछ और ही लिखा है बाबा साहब ने। आप भी अपने बायोग्राफी में इस बात को कह रहे हैं, कितना डिस्टॉर्शन हुआ। वो कैपेसिटी भी मैं गेन कर लेता हूँ। तो मैं ये देखता हूँ आज के समय में कि ऐसा हो रहा है। बुद्धा और कार्ल मार्क्स को बुद्धा एंड कार्ल मार्क्स करके एक तरीके से प्रेजेंट किया जा रहा है, मार्क्सिस्ट इंफ्लुएंस एक तरीके से लाया जा रहा है, और इसमें बहुत सारा शेड्यूल कास्ट का लोग भी है जो उस कैटेगरी से बिलोंग करता है, वो कर रहा है। तो इजंट दैट थिंग एन एप्रोप्रिएशन है? यही मेरा सवाल। थैंक यू वेरी मच प्रोफेसर आकाश।
हेलो। तो इसका है कंटिन्यूएशन में थोड़ा सा बोलना चाहता हूँ कि ये इसलिए भी हो रहा है जो इन्होंने कम्युनिकेशन के बारे में बोला है, क्योंकि अभी हिंदुत्व का बहुत ज्यादा इन्फोर्समेंट हो रहा है इंडिया में। तो उसके अगेन बाकी सब लोग जो अभी हिंदुत्व को जो छोड़ के बाकी सब लोग अभी बाबा साहब को अपना मानते हैं, जो दिखाने के लिए तो बोल सकते हैं अभी के लिए। ऐसे जिन्होंने डायरेक्टली हिंदुत्व पे बात ऑन पॉइंट एंड शार्प, तो शायद ये भी मेरा कंटिन्यूएशन यही है कि ये भी हो सकता है कि जो ये बात कर रहे थे एक हिंदुत्व को अपोज करने के लिए इसका यूज कर रहे हैं कम्युनिज्म और questions not only related and only two questions not to extend as a like of speech. That's my request because of time limitation. We have a lot of our friends to they are also having the questions. So that's my please, sir.
Thank you. I will, since I don't think that Dr. Rutant is getting a chance to reply also to your addition, I think I will treat them as separate, because I believe I understand the link you make, but the real point he wants to make is on an earlier aspect. But I will, so there can be more discussion. I will try to answer quickly. Dr. Pratant, it's a very striking question. Do I own Babasaheb? Which you ask yourself from your, because of the conditions of your birth, which are by chance. We all know it's nothing but chance. I mean, we rational people know that. Of course, other people think differently. So why by this chance do I have this? Is it claimed that I have this entitlement? I have a conflict on this because I understand what you're saying, and I, to an extent, to a very large extent, I agree with you. But there's a small disagreement or clarification or difference, let's say difference, and I'm just going to focus on that first. When I mentioned that I had spent 30 years of my life not knowing who Babasaheb was, even though I was in the same places as him. When I walked into any of these institutions, I walked in believing that they were mine because of my this is going to sound very stupid to say that I was raised without consciousness of caste, but not because of a progressive family, but quite the opposite, because it was an upper caste paradise where no one had to care. So I didn't know what my caste was, but that doesn't mean I didn't have all of the privileges that come with it. And when I walk into any institution, be it Columbia, be it LSE, be it Delhi University, when I walk onto any campus, University of Mumbai, IIT, I walk onto any campus as though they are made for me. I belong there. No one can stop me from being here. That is not a feeling that so many people hanging themselves, so many people, that is not a feeling that they have remotely experienced. And yet, the motivations for their hanging themselves is not a feeling that I have ever remotely experienced because of chance, these chance circumstances. So while I understand that you say that my claim to Babasaheb can be questioned and challenged, because to claim that he is your legacy only and not others is a kind of reification of caste, is a kind of making permanent of identity, the very identities that we want to overcome, the very caste that we want to annihilate, and so on. So I see very much what you're saying. But at the same time, as long as the wider world refuses to accept your transcendence of your category, you have the right to the benefits of that category. So, and others don't, I feel. Others don't. Others have the right to, let's say, other intersecting identities. I'm a lawyer, and so I feel that the case law that Babasaheb created is mine, very much mine. But that aspect of lived experience and of social determination creates obligations and creates opportunities or entitlements that cannot be rejected by sheer force of will. If that were the case, you're in a band, I'm going to name a very horrible analogy. Jay-Z, the story of OJ. Are you familiar with this rap song from Jay-Z, the American black rapper? The story of OJ, it begin, it begins, OJ was a great American football player in the United States, black, of course. And he became so rich and famous and so on that he believed he transcended his race, that he wasn't subject to racism. So in this song, OJ says, "I'm not black, I'm OJ." And then Jay-Z responds, "Okay." And then the refrain is something like, rich nigger, poor nigger, house nigger, field nigger, still nigger. And there's something very, Jay-Z's response, he also being black, of course, there's something very significant about that. Through force of will, I will to transcend the category that everyone imposes on me. But that, it may not be socially impactful, significant. And so, whether you like it or not, I would say, Baba Sahib belongs more to you than to anybody else, until the time that those social conditions are cleared and he can be universal, because there's no risk of him, no risk about him being particular. I speak to you as a complete philosopher. Sorry if this escapes, if these ideas escape, but you are the one who said being is becoming, so you enticed me into this discussion. Now the Hindutva, yes, this is of course very clear. The left has failed so dramatically that what choice do they have other than to appropriate the energy of the Ambedkar movement? It's the only thing that expresses a kind of hope today. It's the only rational clarification of the social and the political. Economic is a little ambiguous, but in the terms of the social and the political, the Ambedkarite movement represents the most ideologically consistent and powerful possibilities for the challenges of today. And so everyone is going to try to take part of that. The problem is, the reason the field has become so pathetic is because of their failures in the first place. The fact that they would not cooperate when they were given the chance. And you know this from Dr. Ambedkar's own life. He made overtures to labor. He made overtures to socialist parties. He made overtures to Communist Party. And they rebuffed him and backstabbed him at every given opportunity. And now, every time I meet members from CPI and so on, Ambedkar, 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 Ambedkar. So from the left to the right, everybody wants a piece of him and his legacy, but the sincerity is open to great doubt. My answers in the future will be shorter, so don't worry.
Thank you, Professor Rani, for wonderful. I used to feel like there's some you know, this idea that growing up, I have a since I just I something to learn so much about this. And I think the question I have is I try to points. I think how this years discuss. You know, and with some aspiration, I thank you.
Thank you for that. What seems to be a very interesting question and posing of a very real problem. One thing that is not going to help you at all, I want to say at the start, is that when people refer to themselves as being from privileged caste or upper caste and so on, the truth of the matter is that we're from oppressor castes. It's not just privilege, it's active structural oppression from which we benefit day in, day out, morning, night, whether we know it or not, whether we claim to not participate or not. And so I feel that that might awaken the so-called upper caste a little if it became more common to stop saying upper and lower, but to say oppressor castes, because that's what the Savarna castes have been and continue to be. That's not going to help you. That's going to harm your efforts when you, if this were the thing that you would say to your friends and family and so on. Even less, yesterday I was speaking at the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, a very elite organization and an elitist organization amongst social elite. Has to be done to spread the gospel, of course, to go in all kinds of places, even where one is not fully comfortable. But one gentleman, obviously very rich and powerful man, he asked me, given the situation today, what would Baba Sahib do to annihilate caste? And I was so taken aback by the confidence with which, in the year 2023, a man with so much power and privilege and prestige still thinks it's Baba Sahib's job to annihilate caste. You know, to take the burden and put it onto the shoulder of Baba Sahib, or those who are working like this. This task is the task of the oppressor castes and classes. It is because they refuse to act, not because they don't have the time, but not having the time is their luxury, of course. And it's not because they don't have the awareness. Turning a blind eye is their privilege, is their luxury. And it's not because they don't have access. It's all available today. I forgive myself for my first 30 years of not knowing Baba Sahib, because at that time, I lived in an environment, in a context where there was no access, there was no internet, there was, there were no, because there was no reservation, there were no Dalits in my social context who could have, splashed some water onto my utopian existence and so on. But it's no longer forgivable. In the 1970s, okay, in New York, but in 2023, if you don't know the writings, the speeches, the movement of Baba Sahib, it's not because of the circumstance, it's because of cultivated ignorance, what Professor Lone at JNU, I think he calls it, does anyone remember? Epistemological. Protected ignorance, thank you. Yeah. Protected ignorance. You preserve your ignorance and say, oh, I don't know about that, I don't have time for that, and so on. But you have time to do a myriad other things that enhance your prestige, enhance your position in society, and so on. So I just would suggest to you to give less, to believe less in the sincerity of those with whom you are speaking. It is not that they don't have time and that they don't know or something like that. It is that these words, this message is going to dismantle the structures of oppression from which they personally benefit, and consequently, they will resist you for that reason. I will tell you, it's not easy. One side of my family does not speak to me at all. Since my marriage, they didn't come to my marriage, and I have not heard from them in 20 years. I console myself that, well, these must be the sort of people I wouldn't want to know anyway. But it will take, some strength and a decision. Is the right thing your kin and privilege, or is the right thing justice and equality? And I choose justice.
Thank you, sir. Hi, Akash. Thank you for the enlightened speech and the information for the book. So, I'm associated with I'm very much, because of them, I try to, So my first question can to history historians do not try to discuss category of important foreign. So when it comes to a history, often at one point in time we can find it important, one point find it and at certain age find. So how do you think that what we are supposed to pursue Mr. Baba as a and when you are considering the space, you are state. What do you think or what do you expect? Better than if it is going to be in that space. You are the future is to be is he is expected to be person. Is he expected to be a revolutionary or is he expected to be a more? The second question is so association and dissociation. When it comes to association, many of my friends they that why you are trying to associate yourself with. So I am very much confident that you must have heard this. So what is the litmus test? Anyone consider himself or associate or
Thank you. The first question is more simple. Dr. Ambedkar, what I try to show in this book, and what I think must have come out in the preamble book to some extent, is that Dr. Ambedkar was a multidimensional and complex person. If we just take the intellectual, leave aside political activism, official political work, social activism, working as a lawyer, as a family, supporting a very large extended family where he's the only earner. Those are all complexities. Even if we leave those aside and just deal with him as an intellectual, he's so sophisticated and multi-layered, even more so than the majority, I think, of your traditional intellectuals, because traditional intellectuals generally don't have the kind of lived experience that informs the dynamism of his thought. So his thought is not, when Dr. Ambedkar makes a statement about a philosopher or an idea, he doesn't do it from the point of view of an armchair thinker. He does it from the point of view of someone who has seen the real world. And so even intellectual complexities of Ambedkar are more than your average intellectual. Leave aside the political, the legal, the activism, and so on. So to say he's extremist, or he's moderate, or he's radical, is to bring into one dimension a man who is not reducible to one dimension. Now we want, or we need, especially as a historian, for him to be that thing that we need him to be in our historical narrative. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily. And I would make an analogy that in each of our personal lives and our endeavors, we may need to focus on a particular aspect of Dr. Ambedkar for support, for inspiration, for guidance. But to say that our projection of Ambedkar as a family person, for example, which was a real phenomenon, or as a great lawyer, I'm speaking now in public, and I speak so often in public, and I get ashamed at what a terrible extempore or spontaneous speaker I am. Can you look at the speeches Dr. Ambedkar gave? The very first one before he's appointed chairman in the Constituent Assembly, he did not know he was going to be called upon, right? He stands up and he says, well, I wasn't prepared. And then he gives one of the finest speeches of the entire 20th century. The finest speeches about unity, coming together as a nation despite being members of opposing camps and so on. And I think I mentioned in the preamble book, the whole assembly erupted in applause. They were so amazed by this speech. What I'm amazed by is that he didn't prepare it. It just came out of him. So as a public speaker, it's that side, an extempore speaking, that I find amazing in him. And it's probably something none of you has ever thought about because it doesn't affect you. So Dr. Ambedkar's multi-layered, multi-dimensional personality and ideas are not something that can be reduced with any fact, but they certainly can be reduced to leverage whatever it is that you need from him in your quest as an Ambedkar. I think we can let him be complicated and take what we need from him in our own path. But that brings to the second thing about in an association, why be in an association. Ironically, you can see it connects to the previous woman's question in a very different social and political context, right? Why are you doing this? Because there could be benefits to not do it. My own students have often asked me, why are you so fixated on Ambedkar, where if you would just do other things like all the other professors at JNU, you would be so famous right now, you know? But since you keep attacking them and focusing on Ambedkar, you have a limited readership. Well, there are many benefits to doing the wrong thing always. There are always enticements. The Buddha, the stories of the temptations of the Buddha is informing us of precisely that thing. There are always temptations to do the wrong thing. But when you look back on what you achieved in your life and what you did for others, then doing the hard thing is what matters. You know, taking the hard decision, making the sacrifice. It's easy to live a life of self-indulgence. But where are you at the end of it? What have you contributed? Why were you even born? To take up space and so on. To do the hard thing is the inherent worth. And I think the litmus test is precisely that. Are you doing it not because of self-interest, but for a larger calling like Metta or Maitri? Or are you doing it because you profit from it, it's convenient, gives you power? These are all of the reasons that our politics are the way they are today, because vast majority of our leaders are doing precisely that. They're not part of the Sangh. They are individuals who are accumulating to themselves, and that makes the rest of us miss out on so many opportunities of what could be. So you have to take the hard stand, and you have to make the sacrifice that despite what you lose, when you look back on your life, at the end of it, you will be happy.
Hello, sir. Yeah, myself, Sushant. I've come from Mohali, Punjab. So, as you told about intellectuality and spontaneity of Ambedkar, I think it's the right time to ask my question. The question is that really about the intellectual point. So, question was like that: what role can an Ambedkarite intellectual play in a making Ambedkar's success? What could be the person who told himself as an Ambedkarite intellectual can do to make his movement success?
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, for taking that, and for your question. I think your question has recently been addressed. There's no answer, there's never a final answer. It will always evolve, and in the evolution of it, that's why Ambedkar's pragmatism is quite significant. Depending on the circumstances, and this is a Buddhist doctrine, depending on the circumstances, you have to adjust the means skillfully. But it has been given a good coverage by Harish Vankade recently in which newspaper? The role of intellectual in Babasaheb. This article, have you seen? Please get my WhatsApp number later, and I'm going to forward that to you. So Harish, who's of course from Maharashtra, but teaches at JNU, I feel is in a very good personal position to address that question, precisely because of something that is visible to someone like me in the attitudinal difference between Ambedkarites in Maharashtra and in Delhi. And I feel like the let's say Dalit intellectuals, I agree that this is a very ambiguous concept. I feel that those in JNU, those in Delhi, have lost something. They're a little bit, how do you say, unmoored. When a boat puts an anchor, their anchor is not stuck, and so they are a little at a loss. The arc of life of Gopal Guru, I believe, is a perfect testament to the arc of a very unmoored intellectual. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it that he's in a way a pioneer. He was one of the first great intellectuals to make it from Maharashtra to the heart of Delhi, JNU, pioneer in that respect, and what an experience he must have had of all these horrible academicians in Delhi, and all of their, imposing their ideas and trying to battle and so on. So Harish, I believe, has that personal experience, and he can give you much more insight than I can. But one thing I will say is that when the intellectual becomes too distant from the realities, the ground realities, then that intellectual disqualifies him or herself and is now just producing pages of no value. And I say that as someone who I feel in the past has produced many pages of no value, precisely because I was disconnected from the ground reality. And so the function of the intellectual is something that has been written about by many great philosophers in the past. Hegel has written a very significant article about this, the German philosopher Hegel, who defends the intellectual against the common accusation that they are too abstract. And Hegel's argument is that actually the everyday person with the street ideas is the one who's abstract because they don't see the whole. They don't see how things fit together. And it is the intellectual who sees how things fit together. And their job is to provide that vision to the person who's working on the street or living in everyday life. Because when you're living in everyday life, you're not given the whole picture. You're given propaganda and ideology and various pressures. So the intellectual has a great function for a community, for any community, to present them with a larger picture. But when they forget that that picture should be representing actual realities, then they are no longer useful to society and they're just satisfying themselves. Those are vague general things. Please read Harish's article for very specific things.
Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. This is Vivek Parmod. I'm the member of Student Development Cell of Mumbai University. So my question is related to the about history. Sir, as a student of history and my basic observation, I'm the speaker. In Maharashtra, my observation is we are saying that there are two different ideologies from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and Dr. Some people were saying that the ideology of Shivaji Maharaj is different than Ambedkar. And there are some who are saying that without understanding Dr. Ambedkar, we can't understand Shivaji Maharaj. So my basic question is, sir, what do you think about these two ideologies and what should be the step? Should we take to reduce the gap between Shivaji Maharaj to Dr. Ambedkar or Dr. Ambedkar to Shivaji?
Okay. That's a very interesting question. I also think it might be a dangerous answer. So I pass the microphone to my friend, who I think will give a much better answer than I can. If I have anything to add, I will add.
Thank you, Dr. Rathod, and thank you for the question. I do not know if I have the intellectual capacity as Dr. Rathod, maybe in 0.% something like that, but I would like to try at least. I do not think Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's ideology and Dr. Ambedkar's ideology is different. You have to know the times in which they live and what they stood for. Dr. Shivaji's time was different, Baba Sahib's time was different. But if you read Shivaji, you see that he has written that
argument has come in a review of his book where it is pointed out, but have you compared Ambedkar to everyone else in that moment of time? How progressive his idea is in comparison to everyone else at that point of time. Sure, each of us can look back and say, you know, I'm actually more progressive than Babasaheb. In the year 2023, our ideas have evolved so much. But why have they evolved? Because of Babasaheb and because of Shivaji. So while there may be some differences, these differences are not ideological. These differences are a cause of a different of historical moment.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Akash, for the wonderful talk as always. Thank you, Satyashoda San. My name is Dr. Kritika. I'm a professor of dance at the School of Performing Arts at UCL University. And I'm also a founding member of Vodakaru with Vedant. Mine is more a comment than a question. As always, you have one comment. So while you were talking about the wonderful initiative that you want to take for providing a room of their own to the underprivileged or repressed, historically repressed classes, I think what is also important to understand in the light of the fact that in the last 6 months there have been 6 books about Babasaheb by people who are not from the same community. I think it's also important to understand that it's difficult for someone who is from the community to be able to reach out because there have been published by small publications. There are 4 publications that publish smaller publications. So it's not, I think the need of the hour is not just for space, but I would suggest that given the fact that you have the privilege, of course there are other people who are doing similar work in that. I think it's also important to create that kind of network within that space that allows for underprivileged to access that space. I think that's also something. I mean, not just is there enough access for your historically low class?
I think that's a good. And I have, in the last about 10 years, I've joined the editorial board, a group of delegates, or whatever is the body that makes decisions about publications at Oxford University Press, at Routledge, at basically all of these top global publishers. And I've done it with only one aim, because it's terrible work. I've done it with the aim of ensuring that any manuscripts that are submitted by Dalits and Adivasis and Vimukta, and we're talking all of the historically marginalized and excluded from these institutions of publishers, that they get a fair hearing. And I haven't done so many things in life that I'm proud of, but one thing that I think is true is that I have led to the publication of more Dalits in these elite publishing houses than anyone ever. And this is, I do deserve applause because it was not easy. I've had to fight. I've been thrown out of some committees. I'll give you the example of Oxford University Press 5-volume Quest for Justice that I edited. You will notice that in every one of the volumes, there is not only a Dalit, but a Dalit contributor who has not yet received a PhD. And I had to threaten Oxford University Press that I would resign from the board if they didn't let this happen. And it is the first publication of Oxford University Press in the history of the largest and oldest publishing house in the world, where they have published people without PhDs, and all of them are Dalits and OBC. So it's not my usual manner to talk about things like this, but this is something about which I feel very, very passionate. On the reverse side, there is also a great interest in the publishers to promote certain Dalit authors or whatever who they think is going to bring them a lot of money. And so there's a interesting danger when you open the gates. You know, the gatekeeping has been done so strong. When you open the gates, will everyone get a fair chance to come in? Not at all. So there's yet another layer that one has to try to think about to ensure that there's some kind of equity in who gets their foot inside of the door. Very complicated. I don't know how to deal with it so far. But your point is very, very significant. And I want to say, if there are any people here that have book manuscripts, even book projects and no manuscript, and want guidance on how to turn that into a manuscript for publication, you can freely contact me. And if we work together over time, I will ensure that you have at least a hearing at the top publishers, not the regional ones, but the top global publishers. I promise you that because it's a very significant thing for us to get recognition where it belongs.
Thank you, sir. We have last two questions. First of all, Jayant sir, my question is like you said, you have studied yeah, I think compared to which has in that time, like whatever has suffered from as being in those and I have heard somewhere about bullying. But I'm not sure. But it's like when you speak and till that time you are not aware about so when
Thank you. So there are two things I want to correct. Don't take it badly, okay? Number one, Waiting for Visa was not written at that time in Colombia. You're correct that that Dr. Babasaheb, young Ambedkar had applied for a passport for his travel from New York to London, and that passport never arrived. Consequently, and I think nobody knows this, very few people know it, he traveled without passport from New York to London. And so the claim that's made by Kiran Kaimode that he was interrogated when he landed by the police under suspicion of being a revolutionary, this is all false. He was detained because he traveled without a passport. That's a very big thing to travel without a passport. In fact, the last time I brought my daughter to Mumbai by flight, she didn't have a visa, and we were detained by the police for a long time, and fortunately she's a child, and so we weren't treated too badly. But you cannot travel without a passport, without a visa. So waiting for a visa was written actually in the 1930s, not in 1913 or 1916 when he was waiting for this passport. And what's interesting is he was waiting for a passport, but he refused to wait too long, so he traveled without passport. You can see the details of that in the book. Secondly, I see what you're trying to say, and I respect what you're saying. I told you that I let myself off the hook, that it wasn't available at that time. And I can see that under your question is you could have always tried harder. And that's true. We can always try harder. But historically, chronologically, waiting for a visa did not get implemented into the Columbia University syllabus until the year 2012. I am from 1971. So this is a 40, however many years difference. When I was at Columbia, even Columbia University did not know that Ambedkar was an alumnus, because after the 50s, when he was recognized for his contribution to the Constitution is fine. That's a casteless document as far as these people are concerned. But what we all saw that he achieved in addition, Columbia University wanted no part of that. They hardly wanted their own black people or Hispanic people or non-white people in Columbia University. Far less would they even be involved in the promotion of marginalized from India. They didn't even want Indians of whatever caste. So the Columbia University's rediscovery of Ambedkar is since 1950s. Their rediscovery of Ambedkar happened post 2000 with thanks to Francis Pritchett and other work of very dedicated but factually wrong people at the university. So yes, so Waiting for Visa was written in the 1930s, not 1913 to 16, and Columbia University implemented it only post 2000.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. So, sir, I would like to ask you that you said that you don't even know about till the age of 20, Dr. Babasaheb or Babasaheb Ambedkar. So, I want to ask, then what happened later that you thought you should do research on? What exactly happened?
What happened was, I think, two things. One, my conversion to Buddhism. So that I felt needed to be an informed process, not just I was a very irreligious person as I was growing up. My father was, as all people from his caste, I think 99.9%, he was an Advaita Vedantist, right? This is the most convenient thing for these oppressors to have that philosophy and religion. And I rejected that from a very young age. So I was open to new understandings and new experiences, and Buddhism appealed to me very much. And so my conversion was not a difficult thing, but it was an uninformed thing. So needing to have a basis for understanding my commitment, conviction in Buddhism, I started to study Babasaheb's Buddha and his Dhamma, which eventually by the year 2010 had become so important to me that I had published a book on this, what was called a critical edition of the Buddha and his Dhamma, which means to provide all of the sources that Dr. Ambedkar relied upon in his writings of that work. So I was happy to be informed by and educated by the Buddha and Dhamma, but as an intellectual, I wanted to know deeper. Where did Baba Sahib get these ideas? So then I went into that. So my first real turn towards becoming a scholar of Ambedkar, I think, was primarily through the Buddhist experience and wanting to know more. And so I produced that. I think it was my first book about Baba Sahib, the Buddha and his Dhamma, which was published in 2011, I believe. And when I was working on the Buddha and his Dhamma, there was this unpublished preface, a preface that Dr. Ambedkar had written, which was never published in the 1957 edition of the book, because it had statements about Savita Ambedkar that were not agreeable to Dr. Ambedkar's inner circle, who were very suspicious of her, and they didn't really want this document where he states quite clearly that he owes a great deal to her, not only personally for keeping him alive, but even for her conversations on Buddhism and so on. So when I discovered that document and included it, then I realized that if that's the case, that there are suppressed materials about Ambedkar's personal and intimate life, then I need to find out if the biographies are correct. And so from that moment on, 2010, I began to start doing new research on Ambedkar with the distrust of the existing biographies. And so I realized the mistakes here and all the English biographies made. I realized those mistakes very early, 2010, 2011, 2012. And it's all this period that my family is forcing me to learn Marathi. So finally, after some time, I could work through Karmodi, and not well. I had to always have my family with me. But then I could work to the Marathi sources, and I discovered that they also repeat very similar, unfounded, not out of for any bad reason, like I think the English biographies sometimes do, but because of oral history, because of the traditions, the songs, all of these things have come in to become established fact. And so I wanted to correct, some of those as well. So that's kind of the history of, first it was Buddhism and an interest in understanding that more thoroughly. And then in the process of working on that book, I realized the biography was also something that needs to be further explored. So I started working on the English, all of the English materials. And then I wrote a couple of books on that basis, like Indian Political Thought, where I tried to put Ambedkar at the center of what it means to do political theory in India today. By that time, my Marathi was not enough to work to complete a biography. And then fortunately, over the few years, I could then get a comprehensive view of all of the biographies and life writings. And so then I worked on the biography. Is that a satisfactory answer? Okay.
Thank you, sir. We'll have last two questions at the same time. With time limitations.
Hello, sir. My question is not exactly related to the coming outside, but what is your message to the parents or knowing powers? Like, we are very fortunate that we are celebrating this year 1 city, and you are going to interact with IIT Foundation. If you see parents from year 3, they celebrate their Jayanti in a very different way. So, grandparents, they have seen Baba Sahib, generation of fathers and mothers, they have known. But day by day, gradually, we are seeing that we are not knowing exactly what he was. We are forgetting, and the children also. So, what is the message to the parents for making them study social science? Like every parent want their children to become maybe engineer, doctors, first earning, then to contribute to the society. So, what is the message to parents? Thank you, sir.
Second question, sir.
Hello, sir. I am Advocate Arun Boras. As all of us are aware, Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar also great economics. And I am interested to hear from you. What would you like to suggest the strategy or the way to bring the economic equality?
It's good that these last two questions were paired because they are both questions for which I'm not qualified to answer. Um, for the latter, about economics, I would personally defer to Professor Torat. Torat's works, I think, have very eloquently captured not only Dr. Ambedkar's economic thinking and philosophy, but also in a prescriptive way, what could or should be done. And whatever other differences, I mean, he belongs to another generation of Ambedkar scholars from whom I've learned so much, but I differ also very much. Despite that, in terms of economic thought of Baba Sahib, I would always defer to his wisdom. So I'm sorry I can't really answer that. And I have to say the same, Aniket ji, that I'm going to say something controversial. I should not say what I'm going to say. I think Dr. Ambedkar would agree. I might have to come back and apologize. We all try how we can, we make mistakes. I think there would come a day where it would be okay to forget Dr. Ambedkar. Now, let me say why I mean that before it's taken out of context and we all hang me as a deserved punishment for what I just said. Imagine all of the people who have sacrificed themselves in the past to allow us to experience liberty, to allow us to experience democracy, to allow us to experience political freedoms and even some economic benefits, if far from equality, of course. Those people, we can't remember them all. We remember very few of them. But we remember those most, and we must keep remembering those most, when the mission is unfulfilled. It's precisely because the mission is unfulfilled that we need to call back these people and we pay them so much respect. But what we all hope, and I think what they all would hope, is that there would come a day in the future where the thing for which they struggled gets achieved. And at that time, they can become more faded in memory. I know that's the controversial part. Now, because I'm saying that spontaneously and I might be wrong, I'm going to stop saying it and move to the more important part, which is that preface that I'm not qualified to speak about these issues because I'm at home in the tier 1 cities and the academic institutions, and that is where I make my contribution. I don't claim to make social contribution. I think everybody in this room has made 5 times the contribution that I have made in areas that I have never been to, right? I mean, we each make our mark where we can make it. And then together we hope that we have changed something. So I can't say that I belong in this tier 1 and my job is to take the intellectual elite and the academics and the historians and the writers and try to guide them to do the right thing and to recognize Ambedkar for the right reasons and for who he really was, as opposed to for their self-interest, for appropriation, for cynical reasons, and all of those. But what I would say is that despite my focus being very different, we do want to ensure that our children, and I practice this with my own, will be able to bring about new insights in that ideology. So what I mean is that if we pass on only our ideology and say, this is how you must respect Baba Sahib and Phule and Mahatma Phule, and this is how you must recognize them and acknowledge them, and this is what you must study, and so on, that we are closing possibilities of a future that we don't know or cannot imagine. Maybe it is that your children need to study technology because the new technologies will bring new possibilities for oppression that we don't even understand today. So maybe they don't need to study the social sciences and so on. And maybe there is something correct in giving them the freedom to bring the next generation of Baba Sahib's ideology into the realities of that future world. So what I would say is that some freedom is probably necessary, without which we don't know if we will have the equipment and talent in our communities to deal with coming crises. I feel I've given such a bad answer in so many ways to you, but let's hope for the best. Thank you for all these questions. I hope that my email and my phone number, WhatsApp number, will be made available to everybody, and we can carry this on in different ways in the future.
Emphasize on two-way communication. According to that, now we have had this question and answer sessions. That is great. Thank you very much, sir, for giving proper justice to the queries of the audience. Now, at the last part of the session, I would like to request Mr. Paresh, sir, please come on the dais for giving vote of thanks. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Jai Bhim, friends. Today, on the occasion of the birth anniversary week of Mahatma Jyotiba Phule and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Satyashodak Maitri Sangha arranged author talk on the book Becoming Babasaheb Birth to Mahad, 1891 to 1929, by Professor Akash Singh Rathod. On behalf of all present, friends and organizers, I express my gratitude to our favorite writer, Professor Akash Singh Rathod, for analyzing the book and guiding us. And with the permission of the Professor Akash Singh Rathod, sir, I declare the completion of today's program. With the due permission of Professor Akash, book signing opportunity with author is open for all us. And after fulfillment of our hungry brains, I request all accompanying, please have a lunch arranged in the lobby to fulfill the hungry stomach to all. Yes. I am declaring that after having a lunch, it will be the end of today's programs. Jai Bhim, thank you. And one request is, there is a bookstall in the lobby. If you